Thank you for joining. I am Jason Delancey. I am a developer evangelist with Here Technologies, and we're going to get started with a webinar that we have planned today on mapping seismic activity. And this is really to give an introduction to Here XYZ and specifically Here XYZ Studio. This is planned as a developer webinar, so some of these webinars get rather technical. The one that we have planned today is actually going to show you one of the applications, and it is something that's pretty friendly for a wide variety of people, including even people who are more technical, who really just want an easy and quick way to start visualizing some data. So with that, I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of what Here XYZ is, and then we'll walk through a sample project that we can build a map for. So a few notes about GoToWebinar or GoToMeeting if this is your first time. There is an area to ask questions, so you can ask questions directly here in the webinar, and you should feel free to go ahead and do that. We're going to take breaks periodically through the webinar in order for us to address any questions you might have along the way. Also, we do have a Twitter handle. Sorry, I don't have it up here right now, but at HereDev. Hopefully you're already following it, but if you want to engage with any questions or reach out to us, that is another channel available to you as well. Even after this webinar concludes, that would be a really good way to get in touch. And I'll have that up on the screen toward the end. And this session is being recorded, so it should be available to you as well. If you miss anything or want to watch it again, you'll have that opportunity. So with that, let's look into what Here XYZ is. So Here XYZ is an open, interoperable, and real-time cloud-based location data management service. It offers simple APIs, SDKs, components, and interactive tools to enable making maps easier and faster for developers and end users. And obviously that's a very much a statement, so I'm going to try to unpack that a little bit for you. And to that point, Here XYZ, where did it come from, or what were some of the guiding principles behind it? Three of the most important points is that the project aims to be open, interoperable, and real time. So by open, we really mean a couple of different things. Open source tools, meaning that that drives code transparency and outside collaboration. A number of aspects of Here XYZ is open source, so that the community can take a look, understand how it works, and contribute back to it or help guide the roadmap. There are a number of ways to provide your input into what you're seeing. If it helps solve your problems, that's what we're aiming for. So if it's not, you should let us know, and I'll show you a couple places where you can do that today. It's also open from a community standpoint, right? So that's what I say. So that feature planning, all of that is based on your feedback, but also open data. What we've discovered is that there are lots of really good data sources. Obviously, you can get data from here. You can get data from some of these open data sets being provided by cities as well. And when you have data of your own that you want to share with others, having a opportunity, a method for doing so. You can share your data with everybody or with just the people that you select, or keep it private just to yourself. It really is about that choice. So when we look at interoperable, what we're really talking about is some of the standards, right? We are built on open standards in terms of geographical file formats, things like that. Hopefully that will ease the learning curve if you're already familiar with GeoJSON, shapefiles, and so on. Even if you're not, we even support CSV files as long as there's a latitude and longitude coordinate in it. So depending on what your background is and how comfortable you are with geospatial technologies, hopefully this being based on some standards is helpful. We also want to maintain the choice aspect, right? So if you're a developer, you might already have some tools that you prefer to use, even if they're not from here. You might think of examples of this like Leaflet or Tangrams. And so we really offer up a lot of choice. So Here XYZ being a set of services, and the terms and conditions being so that you can integrate it into a lot of different tools in order to provide a solution that fits your needs. Finally, here is transparency. I know a lot of people are sensitive, a lot of organizations are sensitive to lock-in due to technology or business terms. So we've tried as a guiding principle in XYZ to be very transparent about what data you can use and everything. So the tool allows you to organize your data in a way to maintain proper license agreements and with our hope that attributions are as they should be. And the final guiding principle here, real time, is really geared around the fact that in order to create engaging maps, having a level of interactivity is important. You're going to change data and want to see on the fly it reflected in the map. You don't want to have to wait for a reload or any of those things. So here XYZ is giving you some live loading of vector tiles so that the data is there, and you can kind of start getting immediate feedback on what you're trying to do. Here XYZ is also really reflecting on some of the scale that we see with here technologies in terms of projects. Certainly you can use it to just, for a personal hobby, just a couple dozen points or something like that. But it really is designed from the ground up to be able to be scalable, massively parallel in terms of the capability to work with geospatial data and then display it on a map. So we've done a few other webinars, and there's a few blog posts if you go out and look, where you can see things like live flights or air quality, some of these examples that demonstrate the scale of the data that can be presented. So what is it though? If those are the guiding principles, what is actually here XYZ or whatever its main components? I think the two things that you can keep in mind, and you'll see this terminology in some places, is that while overall it is a cloud-based set of services for managing and serving geospatial data, there are two aspects to it. XYZ Studio, which we're really going to dive into today, which is an interactive, visual, web-based application. It allows you to style a map, right? So it is an application. It is a web app from XYZ Studio that allows you to really easy, without writing any code, get some results from your data, and trying to do so in a way that's very, very fast. XYZ Hub. Now, this is your set of developer APIs that power XYZ Studio itself, but also power a command line to give you a lot more flexibility in terms of how you integrate it into your own tools and how you make it work. So diving a little bit deeper into XYZ Studio, and this is what we're going to demo today. So I will actually be spending most of my time in the tool creating a map. But here's just a little quick screenshot and a couple of the key concepts, which is that it is project-based. It's around this notion that you're going to create more than one map over time. And so being able to keep those projects discretely separated so that you can go back and edit or keep your data separate is an important concept. And it's kind of the first thing you're going to see when you get into the tool. You can easily upload data, selecting through your file system or just drag and dropping to your web browser to upload the data. And then once you do get it into XYZ Studio, you can edit it. So there is a data grid. You can think of it like a spreadsheet, which I'll show a little bit later, for making some tweaks or modifications to the data itself, or even adding new data. You can add new columns or new rows. You can also create and edit geometry. So that's a fancy way of saying, any points that you want to put on the screen, any lines, any polygons or shapes that you need to draw to represent features on the map. You have the capability of doing that directly from XYZ Studio. And then each layer of data, having multiple layers of data so that you can control the styling independently between them, and the ordering is some of the power of what XYZ Studio gives you. And also because I think we've seen one of the very first things a lot of people want to do is to be able to, not only is that point on the map interesting, there's other metadata around things. And being able to quickly click and view those data or those cards of information, it just seems like such a fundamental thing that most people want from maps, that it is part of XYZ Studio as well. So that once you've worked on a project, once you've gotten the result you want, you can publish and share it through whatever means makes sense for you, whether it's embedding it in a website, whether it's a standalone map, you just want to send a link around, and so on. So here, XYZ CLI. So we've done a few other webinars on the CLI and a few of the backend APIs. We won't touch on them too much today, but just to give you a quick overview, this is a command line interface. This is really so that you can automate and provide some functionality in a way that makes sense for your own workflows. So as most here XYZ, it is bring your own data. So the CLI can help you work with some larger files sometimes. So if you have any difficulty with Studio and the limitations of a web browser, the APIs in the CLI are kind of an extra level of defense for you, so that you can bring your own data, process your own data in a way that makes sense. It is organized based on this notion of spaces. So just like Studio is organized by projects that you might be working on, spaces are discrete areas of storage for you. You can think of it as your own little separate bucket to put data in, and that can be handy when different licensing terms require data to be kept separate. So it's useful to know that you can have a bunch of spaces with data in it. The command line tool and the APIs, they allow you to upload data, transform files. So that's why I mentioned like the CSV, shape files and stuff, being able to get the data out of those geographical formats and into XYZ Studio. These tools are designed to help you with that. There is also the notion of tagging. So not only do you have features, but those features have properties, and those properties can be tagged. And you can think of it as a nice little index to be able to quickly get not just geographical features based on an area on the globe, but also on these other properties that are important. And so there's some nice tagging features that you can get from the CLI and the APIs. But ultimately, you are getting back your vector cloud data as well. And so with that, we're going to kind of jump over and start walking through a little bit of a demo here. So our objective here is to make a map of global seismic activity. There's not really going to be any coding. We are going to look at some data files in the GeoJSON format, and I can give you a little bit of background about that. And then we're going to look at the different features of the user interface and what they're useful for in terms of creating a unique and engaging map. We do have a tutorial that actually walks you through some of these steps as well. So if you miss anything and you want to kind of refer back, you'll be able to go to codelabs.here.xyz in order to figure that out. So with that, I will switch over to a web browser. In fact, I have a link here that I'm going to jump to, which is earthquake.usgs.gov. So give you a little bit of color to this story, right? So the Geological Service has this earthquake data where you can get information, and earthquakes can be kind of interesting in a number of ways. And one of the things that we're going to try to answer here today with XYZ Studio is that if you have questions about the world and there are data sources and you're trying to get an understanding. So one story, an anecdote that might be I found pretty interesting was a gentleman by the name of Frank Bray, and to give you a sense of time, he was actually an assistant to Thomas Edison a long time ago, and he was an electrical engineer and worked on actually a mechanical engineer as well, and worked on elevator lifts and a lot of things a number of years back. But when he started his own company, he started to suffer from burnout, and he went to his doctor, who recommended he take some time to get some R&R, some rest and relaxation. He made an interesting choice in that he went to Vesuvius and was there for a large earthquake. And some of the interesting outcomes around that time and of his research was that you can actually see a correlation between volcanic activity and earthquake data. Or earthquake, because that was around the time that the San Francisco earthquake caused a lot of damage. So So we're going to kind of say that we might be interested in certain data like that. And so then it becomes a question of, well, how do you learn something about it? So as you see on the screen here, they do provide data as GeoJSON. And if you come in, you can get a little bit more background on its data, but you can actually get a feed of seismic activity. So there are sensors all around the world that are gathering some data, and you can get the amount of data or the characteristics of the data that are interesting to you. But if you look at this data, so like even in the last 7 days, it's just a data file. And unless you're really, really good, it's hard to make sense of this data spatially and how it relates to one another. So very quickly, you're probably going to take a data set like this, and there's lots of examples of this, and you may or may not be interested in seismic activity, but the pattern that you go through, the process you go through may be very similar. So whether it's a shapefile, GeoJSON, that sort of thing, you're going to find these data files out there available. And to unpack a little bit more about what's in this data file, you can see that there's some metadata. You get a bounding box, which includes the latitude and longitude. And if you think of requisites or prerequisites for this data, or what this GeoJSON standard requires, the coordinates are necessary in order to visualize it in XYZ Studio or pretty much any other tool. But in addition to these features, you got a lot of other things like magnitude, location, and there's a lot of other metadata here that's being gathered along with it, as well as the geometry. And so these are being represented as points, so just little dots as opposed to a string or some other shape. So if we go ahead and get this data and download it to our disk, we can start making some use of this data. Okay, so I've downloaded this data, and next we're going to go ahead and go to XYZ Studio. So the URL for that is xyz.here.com/studio. So I'm actually going to open up an incognito window just to have a nice clean environment for you. But if you go to xyz.here.com/studio, it'll take you to the tool. And you're kind of opportunity here to register if you don't already have a developer account. It is free to use this tool, as well as a lot of the other features of the Here location services. So I'm going to go ahead and log in real quick. And when you do log in, you'll get a few of those little warnings, like the terms and conditions and cookies, and you can close them out. And you'll be starting with an interface kind of like this. And so, if you're watching this and you're inclined, you can try to follow along. As I said, we do have the tutorial available as well, and we will make the recording. But if you go to xyzhere.com, sign up for an account, it's free. You can start experimenting and seeing if this tool adds value to you. But when you log in for the first time, you're going to look at something like this. And hopefully it makes it pretty clear that there's not a lot of noise here. You're starting with projects, and you're going to create a new project. And you can do that by clicking the plus or clicking here. And you're taken over to what looks like the basis of a map. So you can see that we have an untitled project, and to keep yourself organized, or to make it clear what you're doing, it makes sense to name your project earthquake map. Pick whatever name is meaningful to you, so that you'll be able to find it in a list. You can add a description here as well. So I could say webinar March 19th. 2019, just to add a little bit of additional information. You might even, I might even say who it's created by, things like that. You can tell the story there, whatever sort of additional information you think might be helpful for identifying it. So now that we have a project, we've given it a name as well. We see this little base map area, and this is maybe one of the first things you'll want to look at. There are a couple of different tile layers. and based on your feedback, which you can see that you can provide feedback here, or reporting issues you can do right here. But based on your feedback, we may be able to add additional tiles and different styling and so on based on what people's needs are. But right now, we're looking at, here detail maps or Tilezen maps as well as a couple of different options in terms of the physical look and feel of the map itself. And from here, you can sort of choose the base map that makes sense for you. Maybe you want something a little brighter, maybe you want something a little darker to sort of focus on the contrast. And that is definitely a personal preference. Pick the thing that makes sense to you, and you'll have that style. You see most of the features you might expect from a map. You can kind of zoom in, zoom out, pan around, those typical types of interactivity features. You also can search for places. So for instance, if I were trying to go to Berkeley, California, or UC Berkeley, I can kind of just use the search to be able to find places and get around the map in a relatively fluid way. There's also this feature to bookmark to current view. So if I want to use this area right now as my primary view, I can do something like this and create a bookmark. And so when you're searching for places and bookmarks, you can also find those bookmarks. So as you start exploring, the world and looking at data around different places, being able to jump back to a known bookmark can be pretty handy. So that feature is there for you as well. So as you can see, this is just a base map, right? You get a little bit of a sense of road and water networks and things like that. But it's really going to be powerful once you start adding data. So as you can see right here, we can add data. And there's, as I mentioned before, multiple ways you can get data in here. You can just drag and drop a file from your file system, or you can browse to the files on your desktop. So if I just go in and look at my data and find that I have those earthquake data from this week, I can just select it and upload that data. And you'll get a little bit of a process indicator. It all depends on the size of the data and the structure of the data. So hopping over to a browser while that's uploading, I'm going to go just take a look at what this data looks like. We looked at it very quickly in the web browser. But as you can see, it's organized around a feature collection, and this is not pretty printed, so it might be a little bit more difficult. But we can see all those data that we were seeing before in terms of features that have magnitude, location, description, the time in which it happened, and so on. And where a developer might get involved with some of these data sets is if you need to modify it or make changes to it or do something more complex to assemble the data. That is a typical workflow to do some data management if the data that's being provided through some other third party doesn't quite meet your needs. But once you've uploaded data and you can have multiple data sets, you can just click the add one data set to your map. And you're going to get some visual feedback that we now have data visible. Now, it doesn't look that great. So again, if we go back to our bookmark area, we do see that there is some earthquakes that have happened. If I click on one, I get the card that pops up, which doesn't necessarily provide me anything useful out of the box. But that's okay because this is something that we're going to configure, and we're going to kind of customize this just based on this data that we downloaded. If you look over here, you can see all of the properties that came through in the metadata. And so we can see the place, the type, things like that. And we can actually go in here and edit the data. If we make changes to our data set, it'll apply to any maps that are using it. So I can just go ahead and close that if I want, and I can say, something like open if I'm making changes and wanting to manipulate the data in some way. And depending on your use case, that may or may not be beneficial to you. So what about the styling? So these are red dots, which is actually not a bad look. But maybe I don't like the green color. Maybe I think it's too big. So you do have some choices in terms of, if you want a different shape. So like if earthquakes are a little more square to you than they are round, for example, You can change the shapes. You can change the size to make the points a little bit smaller. Maybe we don't really need big earthquakes represented here. We just want little dots to sort of allow us to still find them. I do like the red color, but maybe I just want black as my outline instead to just make them really pop on the map with the other contrast level. And you can kind of change how big of an outline you want. You can also set icons. So if instead of just a color, if I wanted to do an icon like airports or whatever, there's some here that you can select from that you can change the color of as well to get the look and feel that you want. So maybe pins are a nice look for where the earthquake locations are. In some cases, this will work well. In other cases, depending on how busy your map is, but you can add labels as well to your data. So maybe if we wanted to see the magnitude of the earthquake, we could do that. We can adjust the font size, maybe make it a little bit smaller. White might be the right color, but we can change the color if we want to see it in a different style. I think white makes sense in this case. Make it a little bit smaller. We can always zoom in to look at it. And that's where the data and how much overlap you have on the data really impacts how legibly this type of information can be and whether you want to leave it on or not. You can also move it off of the points a little bit so that if you want to be able to see the magnitude next to the point, you can make a few little adjustments. And so there we can now kind of come and zoom in and get a relatively decent display of here was the epicenter for a particular earthquake and some associated data with it. So one thing you'll notice right here as well is if you do zoom in and you zoom around, you can center on the features of this map. So in this case, because the earthquakes are global, we go out to this wide view. So as you can see, our styling has applied to all of this data. And because of some of these busy areas, it's maybe not as pretty to look at. So we might choose to leave the labels off in our final design, but I'm going to leave them there for now to demonstrate another feature of XYZ Studio, which is when you're looking at these points, you can see that this is a default point style. So you can edit this and change the name and just say that these are all the earthquakes, but you can also add new point styles. And this opens up this conditional editor window, which really allows you to kind of customize things. So let's give this a name. So like maybe we're interested in the big ones. You can select a property, any of the properties that came along with those features. Magnitude seems to be, at least to me, perhaps the most relevant here. So if we select that, we can select from a number of different conditions, whether the value is equal, it doesn't equal, greater than, less than, empty or not empty. So in this case, we're maybe looking for a magnitude greater than, let's say, 5. And if we create that, we're going to create a new style property. And I should have checked. I don't know, has there actually been any? We just downloaded this data. As we zoom out, maybe 5 is too high. So let's give it another number. So let's look at anything higher than 4. Okay, now we're seeing a few things pop up. So now with this conditional formatting, the style, we have our initial ones, but we can also start highlighting a few of the bigger ones and style them differently. And so you can imagine if you continue this out that as you keep adding more and more layers, or even within the layer itself, you can add additional styles. You start creating a map that starts telling a story like, okay, here are some larger earthquakes happening as opposed to where there's lots of smaller ones happening. And as you go around the world, you can see very different results. And so that is the point view. So when we clicked on one of these, I mentioned that we're seeing a little bit of data, and this is the card view. So if you want to customize that, there is this area for cards. And it really is just a drag and drop. So again, you're going to have to know your data. And so some of this information may not have a whole lot of meaning for you. But that's where we would go back to the USGS and look at the data dictionary to understand. But like if the place was interesting, magnitude, maybe I move out the time zone and IDs. And if I come back and kind of look at this, I get a sense that, okay, here is the place where this happens, a more readable description, as well as the magnitude that we see that that's a 4, and this is a 3.5. And so that can be a pretty handy way because very quickly we have a display and some additional information that really helps us get a sense of what's going on in our map. So that is one layer, but what if we wanted to add additional data? So this is all week, so let's just say earthquakes, 7 days. So we can add more data to our system. So I did actually pull down another data set, which we can go grab this URL as it's uploading. But I did a search. Basically, I just searched, DuckDuckGo, oops, and search for volcano data, and this might be a pattern if you're looking for something to help support your hypothesis and what you're trying to look at. You may go out and look for other data sources. In this case, I went over here where you can kind of get a sense of what the terms and conditions are and exporting of the GeoJSON data file. So this is the data that we're pulling in here to our map. And once we got our volcanoes, we can add this data set as well. And now we're starting to get even more data. So it's starting to get a little bit busy. So each layer, you can see a couple of these things like I just did with editing the name. I could delete the layer entirely, or I could just hide it temporarily so that I can focus on one particular layer over another. So now I'm looking at my volcano points. I can come in here and change the default style of volcanoes. Maybe instead of a circle, well, the circle is fine. I don't know what color we think volcano is. If we make them gray, they're not going to stand out too much. If we make them white, it seems pretty busy, but let's make it a little bit smaller. And I think an icon might actually be nice here. If we use a pizza, kind of looks like could be a volcano. Maybe we make those orange. See how that looks if we zoom in. Let's adjust the size a little bit. There we go. Yeah, it could be a volcano. And so now we have this map that's showing us where all the volcanoes are. So maybe that is a little too big. Let's make those a little bit smaller. And what's interesting is when you start putting more than one data set on a map, we can go back to our layers and turn back on our earthquakes. And what you're seeing is a little bit of a pattern here, right? The earthquakes and the volcanoes line up pretty well in terms of where they are and where they're happening. And if we're just looking at data in a CSV file, if we're just looking at data that's being collected from an IoT device like a seismometer or something like that, we're not going to really see this until we start displaying it on a map. And so this is where being able to very quickly import the data, style it a little bit just so that it makes it a little bit clearer what we're looking at could be very helpful, very, very powerful in terms of making inferences about what's going on in the world. If we wanted to keep adding data, we could. We can come in here with another data set as well, such as airports. This is actually coming from Natural Earth, another third-party website where we can upload some airport data. And so as we're creating this map, that we're telling maybe even another story here, which is interesting, that a lot of airports are actually hooked into this network. So when an earthquake happens, it turns out that the speed of light is at least a little bit quicker than Earth. So airports can get a signal to start shutting down, propane tanks and or fuel things, even before any ripple effects from an earthquake might occur. But we can take this earthquake data set, add it in, and we can style that as well. And so, we're getting a pretty complicated map at this point. I might hide my other layers to focus on airports, and this is obviously one where we probably want to switch over to the airport icon and maybe move down the size of this a little bit here because there are lots of airports. Let's see what happens as we zoom in. But what we might decide is that maybe this is a little too busy if we're just showing all of the airports. Let's see what's going on here. To have labels like which airport it is and things like that, it starts getting a little too busy. So maybe we don't want that, in which case we can come in here and actually delete that layer as well. That doesn't delete the data entirely, it just removes it from this map so that we can turn on these other layers again. So what happens if you don't find data to upload, or you want to do something more interesting like in a particular region? So you do also have the capability within XYZ Studio to start drawing. So there's a couple of things you can do. You can draw on one of these layers you've already used, or if you click on add, you can add a new empty layer. So this is useful if you want to draw your own features and keep it separate without modifying the other data sets. So I'm going to go ahead and do that and create a draw layer for this map. And when I do that, you'll start seeing this little pencil up here. This is what allows you to toggle the edit mode. So if I can come in here, I see, some of these big earthquakes, but I might be just saying, well, what about this region? What are the sort of things I can do? From this edit mode, you can switch between the different layers again if you want to be drawing on multiple layers at the same time. But basically, you click this plus to add some new geometry. So this third icon here is a point. So if I click this, I could say you missed one. There's another earthquake over in this area, or something else of interest. Maybe this is where I am if I want to track my own individual location. I can also do line strings. So if I'm saying from here to here, and you double click to end, whether or not you cross over a particular earthquake, or I might say within a particular region, I want to start drawing kind of a bounding box, which will be display transparency, and I can kind of customize some of the properties of that view as well. But now I've done points, I've done lines, I've done polygons, whatever makes sense for my use case. As I'm doing this editing, it doesn't save immediately. I have to hit the save icon. That also allows me to sort of reset it and get rid of it if I think that was too busy. And I really just want to do the point over here and a line from there to here. So when you have these, you can do some editing of it as well. So let's say I save this and I click on it. If I want to reshape it, I can do that. Let's just demonstrate that I can kind of, make changes. I can, rotate and transform it in various ways. So you get used to the tools in terms of your ability to draw and make changes to the map. And then you can kind of save it so that it'll be part of your final map design. And so you might get this in drawing, building footprints or road networks or things that you want to really highlight or make edits to. So if you bring in data from some other source and there's some problems with it, you might want to edit and make changes to it. So with that, I'm actually just gonna jump back out to the main screen because I want to make a couple of other observations about the tool overall. So when you come in and you've created a map like that, you'll start seeing these little cards with a nice little thumbnail image. If I create another project, we'll just do this one real quick. And we're going to quickly just add data. We can add the data that we've already have uploaded. So you can use your data in multiple projects. And so we will do that here as well. We'll just go ahead and add earthquakes here. And we'll leave them white as a different design because what I really want to demonstrate is that now we have more than one project. So what happens from this project view when you have more than one project? You can sort them in a sort of a table view, and you can see the descriptions and the titles become handy in this place. You can favorite some, so like if this is the map I really want to be able to go to, I can star it so that I can just filter only the starred ones. I can search the projects by name to filter them down. So when you only have a handful of projects, it might not be useful, but we're seeing a lot of people that want to create many projects, many maps, many questions that they have to answer, and so being able to get to that. Similarly, the Data Hub gives you this view of all of your data. So you can come in here and get this data table. You can add a description, earthquakes for 7 days ending March 19th, 2019. And so just like we did before, I can come in here and edit any of this data. So like if I know that the data is correct and this is actually a 13, I can come in here and make that change. And that data change will be reflected in any maps that are using this as a source of data. I can also add a column if I wanted to say, you know, track something specific to my use case, and I can do that all here. So there's just a few more things that we're going to show about this, but I'll take a moment here to pause on some of the things that we've shown so far just to see if there's any pressing questions.
Hey Jason, no questions online, not on Twitter. I did put the link for the code lab tutorial on the seismic activity into the chat so people can review that one. And yeah, like you said, it's going to be sent afterwards also the recording. So, but no questions at the moment. Thank you.
Great, thanks. All right, so once we've started building up some of these projects, it again gets into, well, what do we want to do with this? And so each project also has some settings that can be pretty interesting. So I'm going to jump over to the settings. And you know, while you may be trying to answer some questions for yourself, you might also be trying to answer the question with a small audience. So being able to publish the visibility of this so that other people can access it can be handy. You get a couple of options here. So like you can put on a legend or a title for your map. You can also add the description when you publish it. Those bookmarks we talked about, you can choose where you want this publish link to start from, and then you get your map settings. So I'm going to go ahead and save that real quick. And with this URL, I'm just going to paste it in here. So what you're seeing here is an XYZ viewer. So this is a little bit different than Studio itself because it is a read-only viewer. And it takes in a project ID, which is unique to each project. But if I were to load this viewer, I'd be presented something like this. And as you can see, I can open and close this, the title of my map, the description, as well as the legend of the different types of data that we had available to us is just presented here to help add a little bit of context. And just like we saw in Studio, if I come in here and I click, I can get some basic information. I can view more on the a tab like here, but as you can see, I don't have edit mode. This is a view only mode. This is how you can publish and share with other people the things, the maps that you're creating. And so that is the basic idea of sharing here. You also, for ease of use, we do get a little embed link. So if I copy that, I'm going to jump over to a terminal here for a second. In this website, I have an index HTML file. As you can see, it's pretty simple. just your standard boilerplate HTML. If I start a web server, and you can ignore the specifics of this if it's not of interest to you, but if I just start a quick, simple web server, I can load that page and just take a quick look at it, and it's just a webinar. But if I go back and I edit that index.html file and I paste in that embed link, that's, as you can see, it's the same URL that we looked at before. It's the viewer with a project ID, and it's wrapped around with some HTML for the iframe. If I save that file and I come back here and reload, we can get our map embedded in a view. So obviously this is a little small, so you can edit your HTML and adjust your size. I don't think that's actually a style. You can kind of tweak your, based on your affinity with CSS and HTML. And again, so like that's not right either. We want to maybe do a vertical height kind of alignment for full screen maps, but I think you'll get the idea that at that point you're really just in the style of your application. So if you're embedding a map in a blog post or some other CMS, how you'll go about that is a little bit differently, but that gives you the idea that you can copy the iframe and set a class and start making some tweaks to it. And so that's the basic idea around publishing. We also looked at Data Hub. There is another area here in the title. So again, we are still looking for feedback on what you like, what you don't like, what you want to be able to do but can't. Or if you just created a map and you just want to give us say, hey, I created this thing, I thought it was kind of cool. We can help give some visibility to it as well. But I want to highlight some of this documentation. So if you click on the documentation, it'll take you over to more about here XYZ. It is just this website here.xyz as a quick short way to get to it, here.xyz as well. So there is a couple of different sections you can see along here. You can search. You can also actually go to the documentation. The documentation, again, with the guiding principle of open, is out on GitHub. So you can go to GitHub. If you see an issue, you can submit it. You can even submit a pull request to make changes. But as I mentioned, the multiple components of XYZ. So if you want to learn more about XYZ Studio, you can come through here and do the quick tour. Here's a link to Studio that we just started with. But a lot of the things that we talked about today, you can find written up with screenshots and a little bit of a description here that you can make use of to start creating even more complex maps. If you are interested in using the CLI, there is a section here that will actually tell you about how to install it depending on what operating system you're using, and how you can get that up and running. There are the hub APIs, and so this will go into detail around what the APIs are, how tagging works, how to make use of it. And you can see that there is the API reference as well. So if you want to go and really look at the Swagger UI, and so all of these same APIs are actually what's powering the web application that is Studio. So if you want to, use the underlying data and just use XYZ as geospatial storage, querying data for features, getting statistics, bounding boxes, there are a lot of powerful APIs here that you can use in building an application. There is a JavaScript API as well. So if you do want to build your own application from this kind of functionality wise, there are a bunch of examples on how to integrate the underlying APIs in JavaScript to create end results, which can work with other third-party renderers like Leaflet and so on. And we've done a few tutorials and webinars on those topics as well to go a little bit more in depth. Let's see what else is useful to hand. And then GeoJSON tool. So this is, you can be found at geojson.tools, and it's another useful tool, a viewer similar to what we were seeing with XYZ Studio, just a quick editor for GeoJSON. So if I were to load data from a URL or upload a GeoJSON file, like the ones we were just looking at, I can also view them in this tool as well, down to the level of being able to edit the JSON data side by side with the results that I'm seeing. And if you're not familiar with JSON, there is a website here that'll go into the details of what it actually is to mean a point. We saw the web application allowed us to create points, allowed us to create lines and polygons, but this will give you a little bit of more of the data background and some resources in terms of how that all works, the fact that it's longitude and then latitude in terms of ordering of your coordinates and so on. So this is a good site to find a little bit more background information. The other site I'll point out is our developer blog. You can find a lot of useful information about all of the here services as well, but there is a tag specifically for XYZ, where you can get a sense of some of the projects that have been created using these tools, and a little bit more background information on how to make use of it. So if I scroll down a little bit, you can see an example here. If I click on the XYZ tag, I can see some of the blog posts giving you some updates and more details around what's happening with XYZ. So like this is an example of visualizing service usage from Splunk, or finding mapping holiday locations, drawing geometry, integrating with a Wix website, integrating with routing to different points, and so on. So this is another way to learn a little bit more once you're ready to move on from XYZ and sort of grow in terms of what your application is and what you need, and some of the features that XYZ provides. So with that, I'm going to take another pause here just to see if anyone has any questions about what we've covered so far.
We do have a couple of questions, Jason. Well, two questions actually is more about what types of data we can use. So there's one is more about can we do the 3D data, and the second one is dynamic data.
Yeah. So I'll answer that in a couple ways. Generally, the file formats that we've seen most common so far are shapefiles, GeoJSON, or CSV files. If you have other data formats that are of interest, I would really appreciate clicking on the feedback and letting us know that it's, hey, I have this other data format I'm trying to use. That'll give us an indication of what people find valuable. So that's the first thing I would answer. In terms of 3D data, so certainly we're talking about X, Y, and Z, so latitude, longitude, as well as altitude if your data supports it. Within XYZ Studio, you're not going to have a 3D view. You're going to have to use a different renderer. We actually did a webinar a few weeks ago on mapping live flights, air traffic control, which will answer the other question as well, which is dynamic and 3D data, in that we were actually importing and working with flight control data, which was showing the flight paths of airplanes. So that had that extra attribute of the altitude the plane was at the time, so that we could render it on 3JS. I don't know if I have that demo still running, but I would just encourage you to go take a look at the tutorial. So if you go to codelabs here.xyz, go to the global flight tracker, and you'll get step-by-step guides on how to build a map like that. So you got a map projection on a 3D globe with the airplanes represented as whatever geometry makes sense for your use case. So hopefully that helps answer that question.
I will share the link also in the answer to the question. And then the third question was about what's the difference in between here and Tizen tile layers. I'm not sure if I'm explaining it right here.
Yeah. So if we go back into on one of our maps, um, it's the base map, different tile layers. The here detail map is provided by here. Tiles and maps, I believe you can probably search to get a little bit more of the history of Towson. Let's go over here. So this is open source style. So you'll see some differences in terms of where land masses are and things like that, in terms of a style. But this is more of a open source project. It's now part of the Linux Foundation, which has happened recently. So it's just, again, some of that interoperability as a guiding principle, and the freedom of choice, that if you don't want to use the here tiles, you do have an alternative there. And like I said, if you want to see more different tile layers there, or if you want to see other styles, please provide some feedback on what it is you want. And if you don't ask, you may, or if you ask, you might actually get it.
No other questions as I can see. Nope. I think
Okay.
that's it. Let me quickly check on Twitter also at HereDev. Nothing there. I think we're good, Jason.
Okay, well, that's great. Quiet crowd so this morning for me. I know other people, it's late in the day. So, well, thank you everyone for joining me. I'm gonna hop over here and give you a little bit of additional contact information. So if you want to learn more, you can go to explore.xyz.here.com. Or if you want to read the documentation, you can just go to here.xyz. This is the Twitter handle. So if you think of questions later and you want to learn more, you can reach out to us at HereDev. Me personally, I'm at Jason Delancey. So if you have questions for me specifically about it, happy to try to point you in the right direction. With that, thank you again, everyone, for joining. I hope this was helpful, getting a little bit more of an understanding of what XYZ is and what types of problems it can solve. I'm interested in seeing what maps you have, so definitely share it on Twitter if you create something and let me know. So thank you again.